Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ethan Yorke podcast. I am your host, Ethan Yorke, and today you are listening to episode number 3. Now, before we get into today's topic, I did want to mention that in the first episode of the podcast, when I did my solo episode, I mentioned that it would be very rare for me to record episodes without guests, but unfortunately, I did not seem to realize this at the time. It's a little bit difficult to coordinate schedules between two people, especially considering, how jam-packed my schedule is, and then, of course, how jam-packed some of my guest schedules are. So I do have a format laid out for, who are my next guests that I'd like to have and what order I'd like to have them on in. But I've had a lot of stuff happen this week. As far as I've had to, move living spaces and kind of move all of my stuff from one location to another, and it's been really hectic. So between that and a few of the other things that I've had going on, it has been a bit difficult to coordinate a recording session with somebody else for this podcast. So in the meantime, since I'm already a couple of days late on the release date, I figured I would just go ahead and do a solo episode and address something that a few people have reached out to me and said that they would be interested in hearing about. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. If you know me in my personal life, it is immediately apparent that one of my biggest interests in life is automobiles and cars and motorsports. Now, this almost kind of directly, or a lot of people seem to think, I see people ripping on cars all day long on Money Twitter. There seems to be this impression that if you want to be smart financially, you have to drive either a shitbox car or you have to drive something that's boring, right? Like I've seen... with no disrespect to people out there that aren't interested in cars and simply just use it as a form of transportation, but there are other people out there that get, there's a legitimate feeling of positivity and happiness that we get from cars. And I don't believe that it's necessarily true that if you want to be smart financially, but you're also a car enthusiast, you just kind of have to suck it up and either drive a shitty car or you have to drive something boring. You know what I mean? So that's not accurate at all. If you like cars, you shouldn't have to be stuck in, let's say a base model Civic that gets 45, 50 miles per gallon, or you don't have to be stuck in a Hyundai Elantra that costs you $120 a month, whatever it is. You know what I mean? Like, those are great choices. Don't get me wrong, with no disrespect towards people that own those cars. But if you're looking for something more exciting, but you don't want to break the bank and you still want to make a sound investment, this is the podcast for you. I'm going to go from least expensive to most expensive with my picks for enthusiast-based cars that are good investments for you. And what I mean by good investment is typically that if you buy the car for, let's say, $25,000 and you drive the car for 10, 20, 30, 40,000 miles, the amount that car will be worth when you go to sell it 30, 40,000 miles after you've bought and driven it, the value will stay very close to what you initially purchased the cars at. So this is a list of cars that essentially don't depreciate very rapidly or hardly at all, with a sprinkle of a chance that they will actually increase in value as you own them. So let's go ahead and start with my first choice on this list. I apologize if you guys hear me clicking in the background. I am going through my old thread on Twitter where I listed these cars back in July 27th of this year. It is currently October 13th as we were recording this. So let's go ahead and jump right into my first pick for an enthusiast car that's a smart investment. And that would be a 2003 Mazda Speed Protege. Now, if you've ever seen a Mazda Protege in person, you're probably screaming at me right now and saying, Ethan, you just said that if I wanted to drive an enthusiast car, I didn't have to drive a shitbox. Why are you mentioning a Mazda Protege? Well, for a couple of reasons. Let's start with the most significant thing about the Mazda Speed Protege, which is that there's only about 2,000 of these cars that were ever produced. If somebody wants to fact check me on that, you're more than welcome. But I've owned 3 Mazda Proteges, one of which was a Mazda Speed Protege. And I was pretty well researched back then, and I'm basically just relying on what I remember, kind of the information that I used to recite back when I had one of these cars and I used to talk to people about it. So there's only about 2,000 of these cars ever produced. But if you find one in absolutely perfect condition, it'll be between $5,000 and $8,000. So not a whole lot. Not a whole lot for a car, especially considering a car as rare as this one is. So why would this be an exciting car? Why would you want to drive something like this? Well, first of all, it's kind of a sporty sedan. So it's a 4-door car, plenty of room in the back seats, plenty of room in the trunk. But it is a early 2000s 4-cylinder turbo car. I will say, and I'm probably biased because, again, I've actually owned this car. But out of all of the cars in that 4-cylinder turbo space from the early 2000s, I would say this is probably one of the best sounding out of all of them. You know, if you talk about, SRT 4 Neons, some people really like the way they sound, some people don't. I'm trying to think of other cars in that. GTIs, Golf GTIs, things like that. Me personally, I think the Mazda Speed Protege sounds miles better than all of those cars. In fact, it's probably one of the best 4-cylinders that doesn't have unequal length headers that I've ever heard in my life, period. Now, the reason why I put this car on this list is because it's kind of like this abandoned car that nobody knows about, and because it's already only worth $5,000 to $8,000, and that's for an immaculate one. Most of the ones that I see for sale on the forums are between like $2,500 and $3,000. Considering that the car is already only worth a few $1,000s, let's take into consideration there's only 2,000 of these things that were ever produced. There's no way. Well, I don't see there being any way of this car losing any value over time, right? It's already not really worth a whole lot, and there's so few of these cars. So considering those two factors, right, that it's already only worth a few $1,000s and there's only a few thousand of these things that exist, the logic tells you that this car is either going to go up in value because it's limited and it's desirable, or it's going to stay exactly where it's at. This is a manual transmission only car, which is another factor that leads me to believe that it's going to be worth more money as time goes on, simply because there's not a whole lot of manual transmission cars left. So manual transmission enthusiast cars naturally over the years have been slowly increasing in value. So I think this is a car that hasn't quite had its time to shine yet, but I think if somebody popular, like some kind of celebrity or a YouTuber, if somebody like that ends up getting their hands on one of these cars and modifies it and brings attention to the fact that they're so rare, they're going to skyrocket in value. I can almost guarantee that. Let's switch to the number 2 car on this list. And this is another car that I very, very, very much like driving, and that is a 1999 through 2009 Honda S2000. Right off the bat, it's a Honda, so if you're talking reliability, this has got it. It's got its fair share of issues, don't get me wrong, but I went to the shop the other day with my buddy. He was buying an S2000, and he was getting a pre-purchase inspection completed on the car. And it was an older vehicle, right around 100,000 miles. And the mechanic came out and he's like, it's basically just gave him a list of regular maintenance that needed to be done on a sports car that had been driven 100,000 miles. And it was a pretty extensive list of stuff that needed to get done. He's like, oh, this needs to get fixed. This needs to get fixed. This needs to get fixed, blah, blah, blah. He was just laying it on us. Like, this is what needs to get fixed. So he came back and gave us an estimate, and it was like $1,100. I was like, are you serious right now? Like, this guy gave us a laundry list of items that needed to be addressed on the car, and it was barely more than $1,000. Now, I understand that an $1,000 car bill might seem really expensive to you, but in reality, like, cars cost money to service. Like, that's just a fact of life. You know what I mean? And because this is a Honda, we were, if those problems were presented to me on my 1 Series, my BMW, for an example, it would have been $7,000 in work easily. So the point I was trying to make by bringing up that story is that even if you have tons of stuff wrong with the car, it's really not even going to cost you that much to get it fixed, at least in comparison to some of these other cars that we're going to be putting on the list. So not only does the S2000 hold its value like crazy, but it's also going to keep money in your pocket over time, keeping you out of the service shop simply just because it is a very reliable car. Now, the S2000, for those of you who don't know, is a 2-door roadster, so you can get it with a soft top. I think there are special editions that come with hard tops, but as far as I know, if you want a hard top on one of these, you're going to have to just buy an aftermarket one. But by far, obviously I've driven a Model Speed Protege because I owned one. That was a great car. The S2000 is special. It's very difficult for me to describe just how special the S2000 was because I really only drove one for about 10-15 minutes. And keep in mind, I've driven Huracans, I've driven 488 Spiders, obviously I had the F80 M3. I've been in a lot of very fast sports cars, and I've driven a lot of very fast sports cars. Now, I'm not saying this because I want to brag. I'm kind of trying to make the point that even as somebody who's driven a lot of really expensive stuff, really crazy fast cars, blah, 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 the S2000 is a car that is very, very, very high on my list of cars that I would like to purchase very soon, if I can get my finances in order to do so. So if you're like me and you want to buy an S2000, what are you going to be looking at? Well, I've seen S2000s go anywhere from $9,000 for like really cheap ones that are not going to be in great condition. And then I've also seen a few others that go for mid-20s, even close to like the 30,000 mile mark, which may seem like a lot for a car that's well over 10 years old. But again, get in one, drive one. Most likely, if you're somebody that's really an enthusiast about cars, you'll understand why these cars are worth money the second that you get into it. But similarly to the Mazda Speed Protege, the S2000 only comes in a manual transmission. So that is one thing that it's got going for it in terms of it being able to hold its value, which if any of you guys want to cross-reference any of this, by the way, you're more than welcome to go on. I mostly use Car Gurus to just kind of generally shop for cars, but notice the mileage differences between all the different S2000s that you're seeing, and then notice the price differences. And if you can collect a few that are very different in miles but pretty similar in condition, you'll notice that the values of these cars are like they're almost all on top of each other. They're almost all exactly the same. And that's what makes this such a desirable car to own from a financial standpoint, is because even though you may be spending between $9,000 and $25,000, the likelihood of you having to sell that car for a significant loss is pretty unlikely. The S2000 is one of the many cars featured in Fast and Furious that just seems to be immune to depreciation. Almost every car, when you think about it, that was featured in the early Fast and Furious movies is completely immune to depreciation, right? FD RX-7s. You buy a clapped FD with no engine, transmission, and spiders crawling in the interior for $10,000. Like, those cars are crazy. Obviously, everybody knows that Toyota Supras are worth a ton of money. The Honda NSX, Mitsubishi Evo, the Eclipse, Mitsubishi Eclipse, although that's probably the least valuable car of the bunch, at least of what I've mentioned. But the point I'm trying to make is just to further validate that there's so many different things going for the S2000 that lead it to being a car that I put on this list. One of which is that it's a manual transmission, it's a driver's car. These cars are naturally going to go up in value as time goes on, simply just because cars are getting more boring. I'm not going to dive into that topic, but it's kind of just a fact at this point. It's a Fast and Furious car, which if you look at all the other cars that were featured among it in those films, they also seem to be staying exactly the same in terms of what they're worth, if not increasing in value over the next couple of years. And if you want to add a third thing on top of that, it's a Honda. It's got reliability. Generally, the Hondas hold their value over time anyway because people know they can get lots of mileage out of them. So when you combine all three of those factors and put them into one car, you've got the Honda S2000. So that's why it makes it on my list. Not to mention, if you get an AP1, which is the earlier example of the S2000, I think that's 1999 through, I'll say like 2003. I might be wrong about that. Somebody fact check me. It revs out to 9,000 RPMs. Have you guys ever driven a naturally aspirated car that revs past 8,000? It is glorious. Absolutely glorious. Not to mention, not to sound like a huge Honda fanboy here, but you hit like 5,000-6,000 RPMs and that VTEC really is something else. Like, I've never been a Honda guy. In fact, the S2000 is one of the few Hondas that I really even like to the point where I would actually want to own one. But so I say that just to let you know that, like, oh, listen to me hit VTEC. Like, that's not something that's normally in my vocabulary. And I always thought it was kind of like a joke or a meme when people would say that. But as soon as I experienced it for the first time, I was like, dude, this is something else. Like, I really, really like this. So those are the factors that have led me to putting the S2000 on this list. My good friend Yoni, shout out Yoni the Snipe, just bought an S2000 not too long ago, and it is probably one of my I love that car so much. I need to drive that more for sure. So let's go ahead and transition to the next car on this list, numero 3. This one is going to show a little bit of my bias towards the European side of the world. My suggestion for number 3 would be a 2000 through 2006 BMW E46 M3. Right off the bat, here's what I'm going to mention. If you don't know what E46 means, like, you know what a BMW M3 is, but you're like, E46, like, that doesn't make any sense. Is that like a special edition? E46 is a chassis code for the car. So essentially that's just an internal code that BMW uses to identify, what chassis a car is so that they know what parts fit on that particular car. So the newest generation of M3 that was just released, the one that's horribly ugly, we'll get into that in a second. That's a G80. The generation before that, the one that I owned, if you guys followed me on Instagram and Twitter, that is an F80. The generation before that one is a E92 or an E90. The E90 is a 4-door. The E92 is the 2-door. And then you have the E46, which came before that. That's the one that I'm talking about. Then the generation before that is an E36. And then the OG M3 is the E30. So quick little history lesson for those of you who didn't really know a whole lot about BMW and why everybody calls them E46s and E90s and E92s. For those of you who never understood that, there's your brief explanation. Anyway, let's get into this real quick. You can find I'm specifically referencing the coupe in this podcast, not the convertible. The convertibles seem to be worth a little bit less money, and I'm not sure if they hold their value the same as the coupes do. But an E46 M3 Coupe is arguably the best M3 that BMW ever made. There's a lot of people that are under that impression. I've never driven one, so I can't really. I've been in a few, but not enough to really know whether it is something I'd prefer over another BMW that I'd put on this list. But arguably, the E46 is the most desirable M3 on the market at the current moment. With that being said, again, if you check Car Gurus, Auto Trader, things like that, you'll notice that the values on the coupes, regardless of miles, seem to be very, very close to each other, unless there's an obvious gap in condition of the car, right? Like, don't go out and find a car that's got 30,000 miles that's immaculate, that's going for $50,000, and then find one that's got 70,000 miles that's completely clapped going for 15, and then try to point out that my argument doesn't make sense. The whole purpose of this list is that if you go out and you buy an E46 M3 or any other car on this list for that matter, you know, the car is pretty much always going to be worth what you paid for it, if not a little bit more. Something I do want to mention about the E46's value with the potential of it going up in the future is that as BMW continues to make bad cars, which I'm not going to get into that explanation, but the new M3 and the M4 are an absolute joke. The M5 facelift is, in my opinion, not attractive at all. And that car, as awesome as it is, it kind of drives like a Mercedes. It doesn't really drive like a BMW anymore. Truthfully, in my opinion, the only car that BMW hasn't ruined yet is the M2 competition, which is funny because that is, people make the comparison between like the size of the E46 M3 to the M2 competition quite frequently. But the point I'm trying to convey is that as BMW just continues to make cars that are worse and worse and less driver focused and more about just appealing to the mass market, which at the end of the day, it's a business, they have to do it. It's going to continue to make their more desirable drivers' cars worth more money. So the E46 M3, I imagine that this car will probably be increasing in value, especially over the next couple months. I imagine the F80 M3 will be worth more money. Pretty much all the M3s that aren't the new G chassis, I imagine we'll see a nice spike in value here towards the end of the year as the G80 and G82 M3, M4 get ready to release. Now, it is worth mentioning, I want to point this out, it is a BMW. It's not terribly unreliable. I think people have this assumption that all BMWs are incredibly unreliable. That's not really true. It's simply the parts and the labor are more expensive. So you go to fix one thing, which on a Honda might have cost, you know, again, 30, 40 bucks, maybe 60 bucks, maybe even $100. On a BMW, it's probably going to cost you $400, $500, $600, $700. You know, labor rates for BMW shops are usually around like $120 to $150 an hour. Of course, parts are more expensive. So again, just keep in mind that this car isn't terribly unreliable, but if you do have problems and you're not your own mechanic, they probably will cost you a decent amount of money. So yes, this car will hold its value and even potentially increase in value while you own it. But again, I want to stress, it's still a Beamer. It's still going to have its issues from time to time, you know, that are going to be a little bit expensive. So just keep your eyes on that. Or keep that in the back of your mind if you are somebody that decides to pursue an E46 M3 as your fun, exciting car that is still a solid investment. The next car that I want to bring up on this list is probably is one of the newer cars that I'm going to recommend. The last car on this list is a newer car as well. This one is a 2017 and up Honda Civic Type R. Has to be the Type R specifically for this list. I've spent a lot of time researching this car since I did used to work at a Honda dealership. So here's what's appealing about the Type R. Unfortunately, dealerships are still selling new ones with a dealer markup. So essentially what that means is that the dealers are selling them more than what Honda is telling them to sell the vehicles for. The MSRP, or manufacturer's suggested retail price on a Civic Type R, is about $37,000 and some change. I have yet to see a used Type R go for under $30,000, which means if you can pick up a pre-owned Civic Type R, get it around, we'll say $32,000 to $33,000 if you can, if that's possible. I really don't see the Civic Type Rs, even with crazy high miles, ever really being worth less than, say, like 25, or maybe if you really thrash it, you can get one, you know, to be just under 20K. But as far as, you know, you buying a car for $30,000 and it eventually being worth like $8,000, this is not that car. There's no way that would happen. Now, I'm not an expert. I can't guarantee anything, but just, seeing how other specialty Hondas have priced in the past, some other SI models that are desirable, things like that. I really don't see the FK8, which is also a chassis code. I don't see the FK8 Civic Type R ever being worth less than like 25, maybe 20,000 if one is super beat up. So my recommendation, I think the smartest thing for people to do would be to pick up an earlier model, one that already has some miles on it, get one as close to 30,000 as possible. But even if you do buy one brand new, this is a car that is going to offer you a pretty decent amount of amenities. The newer ones have the Honda sensing, so the adaptive cruise control, the lane keep assist, all that cool stuff. The new Civic Type R does have that. So if you want to pick up a 2020 model because you're somebody who really does like those amenities, the car will obviously depreciate more if you buy it new versus used, but it's not a horrendous investment as a new car. It's just much better as a used one. So what are kind of the talking points here? Well, the Civic Type R is probably the fastest car on track that you can buy as like a pre-made package for like $30,000 to $40,000. I'm not including cars that people have modified and then put up on Craigslist for $30,000. If you're looking at buying a car from a dealership or from a private owner that's relatively stock, it's going to be one of the fastest cars on the market for track days, autocross, things like that. Of course, depending on what track you go to. But I mean, the things that I've seen the Civic Type R do, I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen the Nürburgring lap. This is absolutely brilliantly fast. Every time I go out to Willow Springs, there's always a handful of Civic Type R's out there, and they're always running really, really fast times. I've driven the Civic Type R a handful of times, and it is a really nice driving experience. The steering is really tight. Like you can tell the second that you get in it that it's a purpose-built car. It doesn't feel like a Civic with add-ons put on it. It feels like a whole entire separate car. So that is something to keep in mind. They get relatively good gas mileage. I think you could probably hit 30 on the freeway in this thing if you were really trying. I'd guess 18, 19 in the city if you're lucky. But ultimately, it's a hatchback, so it offers tons of space in the back. You've still got all of the space in the back seat. Something that, say, the other Honda on this list, the S2000, definitely could not claim. The S2000's got almost no space at all. It's not a very practical vehicle. But this is a car that you could take to the track. You could beat up. You're not gonna get wrecked by depreciation. But you're gonna be really fast on track, and you're gonna be able to take your kids to soccer practice on time if that's your thing. So again, Civic Type R, great choice for anybody looking to make a sound investment. I think that a used one would be the best option, though, over a new one, as with most cars. So let's get to the next car on the list, which is my favorite car in existence. Just my favorite car that's ever been made, ever. That's just, there's really no other way to put it. And that is a 2011 BMW 1M Coupe. Now, the 1M Coupe is a special car because there were only 983 cars brought to the United States. There's three color options. There's the Valencia orange. There's, I don't know what the black is called, and then Alpine white, I'm pretty sure, is the option for white. It's the same as mine. Now, because this car is super limited, you're already looking at something that's going to, that's going to maintain its value. But this is a car that you won't really understand why it's valuable unless you're really into cars or you've driven one, or both. And the reason I say that is this car is just so special. It's small. It's got the short wheelbase. These ginormous fender flares. Just absolutely huge factory wide body kit. Tons of stuff off of that generation of M3. It's got the limited slip differential out of the M3, the brakes out of the M3, lots of other stuff out of the M3, like control arms. Like I said, lots of stuff out of the M3. But as, again, almost kind of like with the E46 M3, as BMW keeps making cars worse and worse, it almost makes their really good cars shine that much better, right? Like, as when the G80 M3 was released, if you're looking at a new BMW to purchase, your mind immediately just went to the M2 competition. I mean, because you can't really, I mean, you could get an M5, but now you're talking crazy money. And so basically my point is that, like I just said, as BMW continues to make cars that are less about less driver focused, they're less based on that whole ultimate driving machine premise that BMW was built on. The farther BMW strays away from that, the more attention that gets brought to their very special cars, like the E46 M3, the Z3M Coupe, the 1M Coupe, etc. And the 1M Coupe is one of the rarest cars that BMW's ever made, and it's just good. I've driven a few. My buddy Kyle has one. His is pretty modded because he's a time attack driver, but man, this car is incredible. With that being said, you can find them anywhere between about $35,000 to sometimes upwards of $100,000. These get pretty expensive, but it seems like the market is pretty consistent around like the $40,000 to $55,000 mark. And I've even seen ones that have 100,000 miles that still haven't fallen into the 30s yet. So that's mostly why it's on this list. You pick one up for, say, I saw one for sale the other day with 70,000 miles for 44. You drive that car to 120,000 miles, you could probably sell it for 41. You just put all that miles on it, got to experience one of the greatest cars that BMW's ever produced, and you only lost a few $1,000s in value. Again, that's if the values stay where they're at currently. This is another one of those cars that could very rapidly increase in value. I mean, you got to think, if an E30 M3 can sell for more than $100,000, there's no reason why these cars can't also sell for more than $100,000. They're obviously, they're also very limited. They're very rare, hard to find. But, this car, because it's a little more modern, has a little more amenities, it's a little easier to live with if it was something that you wanted to daily drive. And they're fast. I mean, it's got an N54, which is the twin turbo 6-cylinder. Notoriously compared to the 2JZ engine that is in the Toyota Supra, which really made that car what it is. So this is a car that is both a collector's item and something that would be easy to live with day to day. And that's kind of the best of both worlds, because you can own a significant car like this, drive it, beat it up, take it to the track, do whatever you want to do, and you're really not going to lose that much money, if any at all. So without making this entire episode about the 1M, I could literally talk about this car forever. I, again, firmly believe it's one of the best cars that BMW has ever made, period. And if anyone under 40K, unless it's like completely clapped, I would say that that's an immediate purchase if you can get it to pass a pre-purchase inspection. So let's talk about the last car on the list. This is for ballers only, my friends. And I don't mean to discriminate against anybody, but we're getting into the you're pretty much guaranteed to pay six-figure money territory with this last car. Or at least close to it. And that is going to be a 2016 Porsche Cayman GT4, excuse me, I didn't mean to mispronounce. This is a future classic Porsche, 100%, no doubt about it. One, it's a GT car. Almost all Porsches hold their value. Almost all Porsche GT cars hold their value even more. But you're talking about a car that's this special and this good, minus the insanely long gear ratios. And I mean, it's a guaranteed to be a very sought after car as time goes on. So I actually looked up the value of these cars previously, and brand new, the MSRP on a 2016 Cayman was about $99,000. I have never, ever, ever seen one of these selling for less than $70,000, regardless of miles. In fact, I'll pull up some listings here. I've got one. This one has 15,000 miles on it. It's going for $82,000. Got another used one with 5,000 miles on it that's going for $90,000. I've got one that's got 3,100 miles on it that's going for $125,000. And then we've got one with 11,000 miles on it that's going for $96,000. So again, considering that the car brand new costs $99,000, you can see that the values on these cars, or at least what they're being listed for sale for, is very, very, very close to MSRP. And the thing about luxury cars, luxury/sports cars like Porsches, especially the good ones, is that they'll hit this, what I like to call a plateau in depreciation, where, it might initially depreciate when it was brand new, because of course it's a brand new car and it's going to depreciate. That's what they do. But they get to a certain point where it's like, I would venture to guess that as people start putting more miles on these cars, you'll start seeing some in maybe the high 60s, but I feel like that's going to be the plateau, or the lowest point in value for these cars is going to be right around the high to mid 60s, regardless of miles. It's too special of a car. It's too desirable. The new ones are being sold for $40,000 over MSRP, the 2020 models. Because this originally, the Cayman the GT4 was only produced in 2016. Then they took about a 3-4-year break, and now they're releasing it again for 2020. There are minor updates with the 2020 model year. The 2020 is obviously a little bit better, but because they're selling them, like I just mentioned, for $40,000 over MSRP with these markups, that, inherently is going to make the previous generation, the 2016, more valuable, because then people are going to be like, okay, well, I don't want to spend $130,000, $140,000 on a GT4 when I can just go pay, X amount of dollars for a 2016. And as the market starts to move in that direction a little bit more, if that's the direction that it moves in, naturally the values of the 2016s will gradually increase to kind of stay closer to what the values of the 2020 are. Because the 2016 and the 2020 model don't have enough differences for, the 2020s to be worth over $100,000 and the 2016s to not be worth over $100,000. So as people start selling more 2020s, of course, if they're all buying them with the markups paying $130,000, they're not going to be selling them for $80,000, $90,000. They're going to be selling them for $110,000, $120,000. So my personal belief is, as more 2020 used GT4s come on the market, it will increase the value of the 2016s. So if you're listening to this as I'm recording it on the 13th of October, if you can pick one of these up for, say, $70,000 to $80,000, depending on miles, maybe even up to $90,000, again, depending on the miles and the spec, I would say that's definitely something worth purchasing, because, again, not to keep repeating myself, but I really don't see this car ever being worth less than low 60s. So if you want a car that's six-figure money, but you don't want to take that six-figure depreciation hit that a lot of really expensive luxury cars offer, like the F80 M3, for example, the MSRP on my particular M3 was just a hair over $80,000. And the trade-in value on that car, once I hit about 15,000 miles, was just a hair over 50,000. So that car, in 1 year, 15,000 miles worth of driving, lost almost $30,000 in value, versus the Cayman, the worst depreciated one I can see on here, the one that's going for 82. That one's got similar miles, but it's also 4 years old and depreciated almost $15,000 less than the M3 did. So, don't get into these high-end expensive cars and not expect to take a little bit of a hit on depreciation. But if you're somebody that likes expensive stuff, but doesn't want to put yourself in a position where you're going to completely screw your life up if you have to unload the car, and you don't want to take a massive loss on an automobile, then the GT4, I would say, is probably your best bet right now. As far as reliability goes, I know a few people that have GT4s. Most of them are very heavily tracked, and it doesn't seem like these cars have a ton of reliability issues either. I've heard the same thing about the 991 and 991.2 GT3 RS, the one with the 4.0 in it. Although I think you can get a 997 with a 4.0, like a GT3 RS. But the Porsche GT cars seem like they're very reliable because they're meant to be taken to the track over and over and over again and just continuously beat up. So if you're not driving this car on the track, if you're just maybe doing some casual canyon driving or, doing whatever you want to do, I don't imagine you're going to have any maintenance or any reliability issues with this at all. Keep in mind though, again, just like with the BMWs, because it is a European car, especially because it is a Porsche, your parts are going to be more expensive. Your labor is going to be more expensive. That's just a given. So, this isn't something that you're going to be able to completely get by without having to come out of pocket a little bit for. But ultimately, there are seldom cars in this $100,000 to $150,000 price point, especially as new as this car is, that hold their value quite like this. So I really do appreciate you guys listening. It means a lot. I didn't want to go past that kind of $100,000 price point because I don't imagine there's a lot of you guys listening out there that would really do anything with that information, right? Like I wanted to look into like Huracan values and things like that because I know the Lamborghini Huracan is an incredibly reliable supercar. And I think the depreciation curve on those is kind of leveled out over the years, especially with how popular that car has been, with car YouTubers. I mean, people can watch those cars do donuts and do burnouts all day long and somehow they never break. And for a lot of people, especially those that are looking to get into like their first supercar, that's a very desirable thing to have a supercar that's not going to destroy them, on a maintenance, like something like like an Alfa Romeo or, some of the other more unreliable cars out there. Alfa Romeo is the only thing that's coming to my mind right now. I don't really know why. But anyway, thank you guys for listening. I really do appreciate that. I would love to hear what you guys think about this list. Did you like the list? Did you not like the list? What are some things that you'd add? Are there any cars that you would remove from the list? I really hope both those of you guys who listen to me because, you know me personally and you know me as a car guy, or those of you that are coming from Twitter that are listening to this, who know me more or less as somebody who's kind of trying to get my life back on track financially. I hope both demographics of my audience enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. This was so much easier to get through than the solo episode that I did with just myself talking about kind of like who I am as a person. I don't really like talk. I mean, I talk about myself relatively frequently, but I would much rather talk about stuff like this. So if you guys enjoy the car content, I'll definitely try to come up with some more correlating subjects that, kind of dip in both the intelligent financial / like investment sector that I participate in, as well as like the auto enthusiast demographic that I'm also a part of. There's no reason why we can't coexist and everything kind of merge together. And that was kind of my goal of this podcast, to show that despite people on money Twitter seeming to think that it's absolutely the worst thing in the world to want, fast sports cars or just any kind of like flashy car in general, but there are options for you out there to where you can enjoy having a lead foot and still not destroy your bank account. So we will see you guys next week, hopefully with a guest this time for episode 4, if I can get my scheduling figured out. But once again, thank you for listening, and we will see you guys next week.